Hello there, everybody. Say, how would you like to round out the work week and move into the weekend with one really weird Bible passage? You want to do it? Hey, let's do it because we have one this week. And it's sort of weird in and of itself, but it makes reference to another weird Bible passage that we have. So what are we talking about? We're talking about First Peter, the third chapter. Now, before we get into the weirdness, just a very brief word about this letter, First Peter. We do not know who the author is. It definitely is not the Apostle Peter. It takes his name, but that was common parlance in that time that you would, attach your whatever you're saying, your letter, your literary work to someone who was very well known and respected as the Apostle Peter. But this was definitely written at the very end of the first century. And Peter, he's passed away by then. All right, he's joined the church triumphant, which this letter talks about quite a bit. So the author is writing to a group of Christians who are going through some pretty rough times. And this was a very difficult time, the end of the first century, to be a Christian in the Roman Empire. A lot of persecution was starting to pick up at this time. So we have this passage that, well, let me just read it. It's a short one, but I want to read the verses that are kind of weird and strange. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all. And parenthetically, that's awesome. That's an awesome thing. Christ suffered for sins once for all. It's done, folks. It is done. As Jesus said from the cross, it is finished. That's something we can hang our lives on. We can hang our hopes on. We can hang our sorrows on. I mean, it's a great way to start Lent. Christ also suffered for sins once for all. The cross. It's done. All right. But let's move on. The righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. We don't have to go to God. Jesus has done that for us. Isn't that awesome? Okay. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. Now this is where it starts getting weird. In which also he went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey when God waited patiently in the days of Noah during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were saved through water. And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. All right, and it finishes out our reading for this week by the end of that verse. But do you catch the weirdness? He went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison. This is where a lot of very, very old Orthodox Christianity picks up on that whole image that gets inserted into the Apostles' Creed. And this gets inserted late into the Apostles' Creed. It wasn't originally in there, but he descended into hell. Did you notice what we read here doesn't mention anything about Jesus descending into hell? Now, more appropriately, that should be translated, he descended to the dead, to the abode of the dead. This is really not even saying that, although you would get that when it talks about making a proclamation to the spirits in prison who in former times, so in other words, they've passed away by this time, but they're in prison. What does that mean? Well, you have to go back to what's being referenced here, Noah, and just before God gives Noah the go ahead to start building the ark, it talks about the sons of God. And who are the sons of God? Who had an eye on the daughters of human beings, and they kind of got together with them and had babies, and these babies ended up being fantastic warriors on the earth, and before you know it, there's all kind of hatred and conflict, and what a mess. And that's when God just says, enough's enough. I'm gonna just put an end to all this. I'm sorry I ever created human beings in the first place. But he found favor with Noah. So Noah and his family built the ark, and the world was cleansed in the great flood, and there was that big do-over. Okay? That's the background. But again, it gets back to, who are these spirits in prison? We often think of, well, Jesus descended into hell, and he preached to those people down there, and there's some other early Christian literature that alludes to this, especially in the book of Enoch. And he preached to them and offered salvation to them because they were pre-Jesus, remember? And now Jesus, resurrected from the dead, was offering them new life. Well, we don't really know. It's so difficult to figure this out. So I'm going to leave it to you to try to find more information on that, and you can try to figure it out, okay? Because it's beyond the scope of what I can understand, except for this. What the author of First Peter is trying to do is make a reference to our baptism. He said, baptism, which this prefigures, now saves you. And it's not the baptism itself, it's what God has done for us in baptism. And part of it is, later on in that verse, it says, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience. An appeal to God. This is not something that we can take lightly. This appeal to God is made reference to in much of early Christian literature in the baptismal ceremonies that were being held by the Christians. And what they were doing is they were pledging to resist the devil and all the forces of evil, which we do in our Lutheran baptismal service. We make that pledge. Now, we know full well that we're going to blow it. We're not going to always do that, and we're going to fall to the forces of evil in this world. We're going to fall victim to them. But it is God who, through the resurrection of Jesus, through his suffering, death, and resurrection, raises us up and gives us the power to overcome this, because, as it says at the very end, he has gone into heaven, meaning Jesus, sits at the right hand of God with the angels and authorities and powers made subject to him. Jesus steps on all those. He has them under his feet. He is in control. The letter to 1 Peter is written to people who are suffering for their faith, for confessing Jesus as Lord. And what Peter is telling them is, hang tight, hang tough. God has got this. So even with all the strangeness and the strange imagery and the reference to these sons of God who mess around with the daughters of humanity and end up having these, actually end up being giants, huge warriors that just make a mess on earth, let's kind of put all that aside for right now and don't worry too much about that. It is kind of interesting, but the whole point is, God's got this. God has you and me in his hands. No matter what may come, what may befall us, it is better for us to suffer for Christ than to suffer because we're just plain being stupid, right? No. Jesus did the suffering for us once and for all of our sin. God's got us. It's good. God bless you in your daily life. Hopefully you don't go through that kind of suffering, but do know He has us in His loving arms. God's blessings be with you this day.